Steven Spielberg paid $52 million to tell his story. The FBI put him on their payroll. Major banks across America hired him as a consultant and paid him handsomely for his expertise. He appeared on talk shows, gave lectures at universities, and spent decades being celebrated as one of the most audacious criminals in American history. And it all started, allegedly, with stealing $1,200 from a flight attendant. His name was Frank William Abagnale Jr., and depending on who you ask, he was either the most brilliant con artist who ever lived, or the most brilliant con artist who ever lived. The difference between those two answers is everything, and by the end of this story, you will understand exactly what that means. But first, let's build the legend, because the legend is where the real magic happens. Frank Abagnale Jr. was born on April 27, 1948, in Bronxville, New York. His father, Frank Abagnale Sr., was a respected local businessman who ran a stationery store and had modest political ambitions. His mother, Paulette, was a French woman who had come to America after the Second World War and never fully left behind the elegance she brought with her from Paris. By all accounts, Frank's early childhood was comfortable, suburban, normal. But normal has a way of falling apart when the people holding it together stop believing in each other. When Frank was 16 years old, his parents sat him down and told him they were getting a divorce. This was 1964. Divorce was not the casual, bureaucratic event it sometimes feels like today. In a tight-knit Catholic community in suburban New York, it carried weight. It carried shame. It rearranged the entire architecture of a family and of a child's understanding of the world. Frank was caught in the middle of a custody dispute neither of his parents handled with particular grace. The court asked him to choose which parent he wanted to live with. He couldn't do it. So instead of choosing, he ran. He disappeared into New York City with very little money in his pocket and no plan beyond putting distance between himself and a decision he didn't want to make. He was a teenager, alone in one of the largest and most unforgiving cities in the world. No job, no connections, no safety net. What he had, and what he would later claim saved him every single time, was a face that looked older than his age, a voice that carried authority it had no right to carry, and an almost supernatural ability to read people, to understand what they wanted to see, to become, in any given moment, exactly who the situation required. That talent, raw and untrained as it was, would take him further than almost anyone could imagine. And it would eventually raise a question that cuts right to the heart of who Frank Abagnale really was. If a man is brilliant enough to convince the entire world of a lie, does it matter whether the lie is about a crime or about himself? We'll get there. But first, let's watch him learn. New York City in 1964 was not a kind place for a 16-year-old with empty pockets. The city was loud, expensive, and indifferent to anyone who couldn't keep up. Frank quickly discovered that his age was working against him. Employers didn't want to hire a teenager with no experience and no references. Landlords didn't want to rent to someone who couldn't prove steady income. Every door he knocked on opened just wide enough for someone to look him over and then close again. So he made himself older. It started small. When filling out job applications, he began listing his age as 26 instead of 16. The effect was immediate and striking. People treated him differently. They took him seriously. They stopped looking past him and started looking at him. Frank filed that observation away like a tool he had just discovered in a drawer. Something simple, almost embarrassingly simple, that turned out to be extraordinarily useful. He also discovered, around this time, that his father's good name still carried some weight in certain circles. Frank Sr. had accounts at local businesses, a reputation as a reliable man, a face that people remembered fondly. Frank Jr. began leveraging that name, carefully at first, then with growing confidence. He would walk into a store, mention his father, and walk out with credit he hadn't earned. It wasn't sophisticated. It wasn't the work of a criminal mastermind. It was a teenager figuring out which levers moved which doors. But the lessons were accumulating. Every small deception that worked taught him something about how people process information, how they rely on context, on appearance, on their own assumptions to fill in the gaps that a confident stranger leaves behind. People, Frank was learning, do not verify what they already believe, they confirm it. And if you give them enough to believe, they will do the rest of the work for you. His first significant scheme involved his father's credit card. Frank Sr. had given him the card for emergencies. Frank used it for something else entirely, charging purchases at gas stations and then negotiating with attendants to take a portion of the charge in cash. It was a crude form of fraud, the kind that gets discovered quickly and leaves an obvious trail. It did get discovered. His father confronted him. The card was taken away. But the principle had lodged itself in Frank's mind like a splinter. Credit, the extension of trust before verification, was a gap in the system. And gaps, he was beginning to understand, were opportunities. The checking account scheme came next. Frank opened a bank account, received a checkbook, and began writing checks against funds he didn't have. In the mid-1960s, the infrastructure for catching this kind of fraud moved slowly. Checks took days to clear. Banks communicated with each other through the mail. A young man with a presentable appearance and a plausible story could cash a bad check at one branch, be 3 states away by the time anyone noticed, and start the process again somewhere new. This was the foundation. This was the actual criminal enterprise of Frank Abagnale Jr., a traveling check-kiting operation, unsophisticated in its mechanics, but sustained by his ability to walk into a bank, chat with the teller, smile at exactly the right moment, and leave with money that wasn't his. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't the stuff of Hollywood films, but it worked. And Frank, still a teenager, was getting very good at it. The question of when exactly Frank Abagnale decided to become a Pan Am pilot depends on which version of the story you're hearing, and there are several. In his own memoir, published in 1980, he describes the inspiration striking him almost accidentally. He was, he claimed, staying at a hotel in New York when he noticed a Pan Am flight crew walking through the lobby. The pilots moved with an authority that seemed effortless. People stepped aside for them. Hotel staff greeted them with particular deference. Strangers looked at them with something close to admiration. Frank watched all of this and understood it immediately. The uniform wasn't just clothing, it was a social signal, a compressed communication that told everyone in the vicinity exactly how to behave toward the person wearing it. The uniform said, "This man has been vetted. This man belongs to a serious institution. This man does not need to be questioned." Frank wanted that, not the flying. He had no interest in actually operating an aircraft. He wanted the frictionless movement through the world that the uniform provided. He wanted to be the man that other people stepped aside for. Getting the uniform turned out to be simpler than it had any right to be. Frank called Pan Am's uniform supplier, identifying himself as a first officer who had lost his uniform and needed a replacement urgently before an upcoming flight. He provided a fake employee number, a number he had constructed after a brief, casual conversation with an actual Pan Am employee in which he had asked enough questions to understand the format. The supplier, operating on the reasonable assumption that someone calling from within the system was part of the system, processed the order without significant scrutiny. The uniform arrived. Frank put it on and stood in front of a mirror. He looked, by his own account, completely legitimate. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we do, subscribe to the channel right now. Every week, we bring you stories like this one, people who bent reality so far it snapped, and the truth that came out on the other side. The ID card was the next problem. Pan Am employees carried identification that allowed them access to airports, crew lounges, and the special treatment that came with being part of one of the most prestigious airlines in the world. Frank needed one. He couldn't simply order it from a supplier the way he had the uniform. So he did something that would become his signature approach to every obstacle he encountered. He broke the problem down into its components and solved each one separately. He obtained a Pan Am ID card, the physical object, the laminated card itself, through a combination of social engineering and patient observation. He visited airports, watched how crew members moved through checkpoints, paid attention to what people actually looked at when they checked credentials. What he found was both reassuring and alarming. depending on your perspective. Most people checking IDs were not looking for forgeries. They were performing a ritual. They glanced at the card, confirmed that it looked like what a card was supposed to look like, and waved the holder through. The actual information on the card, the employee number, the dates, the specific formatting, mattered far less than the confidence with which it was presented. Frank altered an existing ID. Some accounts suggest he used a Pan Am model kit he found at a hobby store, which included a small replica of the airline's logo, and produced something that passed casual inspection with no difficulty at all. Was it a perfect forgery? Almost certainly not. But it didn't need to be perfect. It needed to be good enough for a 2-second glance from a gate agent who was already moving on to the next person in line. Armed with the uniform and the ID, Frank Abagnale stepped into the world as First Officer Frank Williams of Pan Am Airlines. He was, depending on the specific account, somewhere between 16 and 18 years old. And almost immediately, the world opened up for him in ways that the teenager running from a custody dispute in Bronxville could never have imagined. Airline crews in the 1960s operated within a world of extraordinary privilege. Pan Am, in particular, was not simply a carrier. It was an institution, a symbol of American power and sophistication at its post-war peak. Its pilots were treated like visiting dignitaries in hotels across the world. They flew free on any airline that had a reciprocal agreement with Pan Am, which, in practice, meant almost any airline worth mentioning. They ate in the best hotel restaurants on the company's account. Doors that were closed to ordinary travelers swung open for them without a word being exchanged. Frank Abagnale walked straight into all of it. The deadheading system, the practice of allowing off-duty crew members to fly free on available seats, was his primary vehicle. A pilot in uniform with a valid-looking ID could walk up to almost any airline counter, present his credentials, and be waved onto a flight at no cost. The system operated on trust. It assumed that anyone who looked like a pilot, carried a pilot's identification, and spoke like a pilot had been thoroughly vetted by the institution they represented. Checking that assumption would have required a phone call, a record search, an interruption of the smooth choreography of airport operations. Nobody made that call. Over the course of what Frank would later claim were nearly 2 years of operating as a Pan Am first officer, he reportedly flew over 2 million miles across 26 countries, all without paying a single fare. He stayed in hotels that billed Pan Am directly. He ate meals in crew facilities at airports around the world. He socialized with actual pilots, navigators, and flight attendants who never questioned his presence because his uniform and his manner gave them no reason to. And here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, regardless of how much of it is true. Frank was not a pilot. He had received no flight training. He understood nothing about the actual mechanics of operating a commercial aircraft. If anyone had sat him down in a cockpit and asked him to do anything beyond occupying a seat, the deception would have collapsed in seconds. But nobody ever did. Because the uniform, the ID, and the confidence, that particular combination, created a reality so convincing that the people around him simply incorporated him into their existing understanding of the world and moved on. He was careful about what he claimed to know. When real pilots talked shop, when the conversation turned to technical details about specific aircraft, navigation systems, instrument readings, Frank would deflect with a self-deprecating comment about being rusty or redirect the conversation towards something he could actually discuss. He was charming. He was attentive. He asked questions that made the person answering them feel knowledgeable and appreciated. These are not the skills of a criminal. They are the skills of a gifted social operator. Someone who understands that people's favorite subject is themselves, and that the best way to be liked is to be sincerely interested. He also had, by this point, developed an instinct for exits. The moment a conversation began moving toward territory that might expose him, he found a reason to be somewhere else. A watch consulted, a bag that needed checking, a flight he had suddenly remembered he needed to prepare for. He never pushed a situation to its limits. He left while the leaving was still smooth. This instinct, knowing when to go, was arguably his most valuable asset, and it would serve him in situations far more dangerous than a hotel bar conversation with a curious co-pilot. The Pan Am identity sustained him for a considerable period, but Frank was always working on parallel tracks. The check fraud that had funded his early days in New York never fully stopped. It evolved. He became more sophisticated about which banks to target, which branches were likely to be understaffed, which times of day produced the most distracted tellers. He learned to type, which allowed him to alter the routing numbers on checks, a technical manipulation that delayed detection and extended the window in which a fraudulent check could be cashed before anyone caught the discrepancy. He also began to understand the value of professional identity beyond the airline world. The next persona Frank built was that of a doctor. The story he told in his memoir and in countless interviews over the following decades goes like this. While passing through Atlanta, Georgia, he struck up a conversation with a woman who mentioned she was a nurse. One thing led to another, and Frank found himself claiming to be a pediatrician who had recently moved to the area. The woman, who worked at a hospital, mentioned that the facility was chronically short-staffed and asked whether Frank might be interested in a supervisory position that didn't require direct patient care. Frank said yes. What followed, according to Frank's account, was approximately 11 months working as a supervising pediatric resident at a Georgia hospital, a position that placed him in a medical environment every day, surrounded by actual doctors and nurses, without any medical training whatsoever. He managed the situation, he explained, by doing what he had always done, asking questions, listening carefully, delegating anything that required genuine expertise, and projecting enough confidence that the people around him filled in the gaps themselves. He was always careful to emphasize, directly treated a patient. He reviewed paperwork. He attended administrative meetings. He supervised staff on procedural matters. When medical questions arose that required actual knowledge, he deferred to the residents and interns working under him, framing his deference as a managerial preference for developing his team's independent judgment, rather than an admission of ignorance. It was, if true, an almost unbelievably sustained performance. 11 months is a long time to maintain a fiction in an environment where your colleagues are highly educated professionals, trained in exactly the kind of precise observation and critical thinking that should, in theory, expose a fraud immediately. The fact that he got away with it, again if true, says something unsettling about the degree to which institutional authority, professional hierarchy, and the simple human preference for comfortable assumptions can override direct evidence. He left the hospital position, he claimed, before anyone grew too suspicious. He moved on. He always moved on. The legal persona came next, and it was perhaps the most audacious of the three. Frank's account of how he became a practicing attorney in the state of Louisiana is a masterclass in exploiting bureaucratic assumptions. The bar exam, the licensing examination that certifies a lawyer's fitness to practice, is a rigorous test of legal knowledge. It is not, however, accompanied by the kind of identity verification that might catch someone who had fabricated an undergraduate degree and a law school education from whole cloth. Frank obtained a fake transcript from Harvard Law School. He applied to sit the Louisiana bar exam under the name Frank Williams. He failed it twice. On his third attempt, he passed. He was then, by the state of Louisiana's own reckoning, a licensed attorney. He secured a position in the office of the Louisiana Attorney General, a government law office, and worked there for approximately a year before a colleague, also a Harvard graduate, began asking questions about mutual acquaintances and specific professors that Frank couldn't answer convincingly. Rather than risk exposure, Frank resigned, citing a desire to return to private practice. The Harvard credential had carried him through an entire professional licensing process and into a government legal position. Nobody had called Harvard to verify his degree. Nobody had cross-referenced his transcript against actual university records. The document looked right. The man presenting it behaved as though it were real. That was enough. There is a pattern here that goes beyond Frank Abagnale specifically. Every institution he penetrated operated on the same fundamental assumption, that the credentials a person presents have already been verified by someone else. Hospitals assume medical schools vetted their graduates. Law offices assume the Bar Association verified their attorneys. Airlines assume their HR departments screened their pilots. Nobody is responsible for the first check because everyone assumes it has already been done. Frank didn't find a hole in any specific system. He found the hole that runs through all systems, the gap between the last person who was supposed to verify and the first person who assumed verification had happened. He lived in that gap. He made it his home. The check fraud operation was running continuously beneath all of these personas, generating the cash that funded his movements. By the mid-1960s, Frank had refined his technique to a point where he was producing what investigators would later describe as some of the most technically accomplished fraudulent checks they had encountered. He wasn't using sophisticated equipment. This was years before the personal computer, decades before digital printing. He worked with typewriters, rubber stamps, commercially available printing supplies, and a detailed understanding of how bank routing systems processed paper checks. His signature innovation, and it was genuinely innovative in the narrow sense of being something investigators hadn't seen before, was the manipulation of the MICR line. MICR stands for Magnetic Ink Character Recognition, the line of numbers at the bottom of every check that tells the banking system which institution to route the check to for clearance. By altering the routing number on a legitimate check, Frank could cause the check to be sent to the wrong bank for processing. The wrong bank would not find the check in its records, would flag it as an error, and would return it through the mail, a process that, in the 1960s, took days. During those days, the funds were often already released. By the time the error was identified and the fraud recognized, Frank was gone. He was careful about geography. He never worked the same bank twice in the same city. He never stayed in one place long enough for a pattern to emerge. He moved constantly. New York to Miami to Los Angeles to Chicago to New Orleans, then across the Atlantic to Europe, where the banking systems were even slower to communicate with their American counterparts, and the trail went cold almost immediately. By his own estimate, and here, as with everything Frank Abagnale claims, the numbers should be held loosely, he passed fraudulent checks totaling somewhere between $2.5 million over the course of his criminal career. Law enforcement investigators who later reviewed the actual case files arrived at figures considerably lower than that. But the operation was real, the fraud was real, the money was real, even if the exact amounts remained disputed. What is not disputed is that by the late 1960s, Frank Abagnale Jr. had become a genuinely significant target for law enforcement on both sides of the Atlantic. The FBI had opened a file on him. Interpol was aware of him. Multiple European police agencies were looking for a young American who moved like a professional and left nothing behind but a trail of worthless paper. The chase, which Frank would later describe with the kind of affectionate nostalgia that suggests he enjoyed it at least as much as the crimes themselves, was entering its final phase. The man chasing Frank most persistently was an FBI agent named Joseph Shea. Frank would later describe Shea in his memoir with what reads as genuine admiration. A serious, methodical investigator who understood his quarry well enough to anticipate his movements and who came closer to catching him on multiple occasions than anyone else ever did. Shea appears in the memoir as a kind of worthy opponent, the professional foil to Frank's gifted amateur, the institutional force against the individual renegade. Whether their relationship was actually as Frank described it is a question we will return to. For now, let's follow the story where it leads. Shea's approach, as Frank reconstructed it, was to study the check fraud patterns, the routing number manipulations, the geographic spread, the timing, and work backward toward a profile. The frauds had a consistency to them that suggested a single operator rather than an organization. The checks were too technically similar, the social engineering too stylistically uniform. This was one person, Shea concluded. A young person, probably male, almost certainly American, working alone. The profile narrowed, the net tightened. Frank, for his part, was not oblivious to the pressure. He had developed sources, casual contacts at hotels and airports who would mention, without always understanding why they were mentioning it, that certain people had been asking certain questions. He paid attention to patterns in his environment the way a prey animal pays attention to sounds in the undergrowth. When something felt wrong, he moved. But by 1969, he had been moving for 5 years. He was tired. He was 21 years old, and he had spent his entire adult life being someone else, in a different city every few weeks, with no permanent address, no lasting relationships, no continuity of identity. The freedom that the life provided had a cost that compound interest was beginning to collect. He was in Montpellier, France, when it finally ended. Montpellier in the autumn of 1969 was a university city, quiet, provincial by French standards, the kind of place where a young American with a convincing manner and a pilot's uniform could blend into the background of student cafes and narrow medieval streets without drawing particular attention. Frank had been in France for several months by that point, moving between Paris, Nice, and the south, running check schemes against European banks that were even less coordinated in their fraud detection than their American counterparts. He had also, in a development that complicated everything, fallen into something resembling a normal life. Her name was Anne. She was a French woman he had met in a cafe in Montpellier. A schoolteacher, warm and direct in the way that people who spend their days managing classrooms tend to be. Frank had introduced himself under one of his working names, presented himself as an airline pilot between assignments, and found that the conversation came easily in a way that conversations rarely did when he was performing a role. With Anne, something different was happening, something that felt uncomfortably like honesty. He didn't tell her the truth. He never told anyone the truth. But he stopped elaborating the lie beyond what was necessary, which for Frank Abagnale was as close to candor as he had come in years. He stayed in Montpellier longer than he should have. He let himself become a recognizable face in a neighborhood. He let himself be known. That was the mistake. The French police, working from an Interpol alert that had been circulating for months, had been cross-referencing reports of check fraud in the region with the profile of a young American male operating under multiple identities. A bank teller in Montpellier recognized a description. A hotel clerk remembered a name from a registration card. The threads, individually thin, were enough when pulled together. On a morning in late 1969, French police officers knocked on the door of the apartment where Frank was staying. He opened it. He looked at the uniforms. And for the first time in 5 years, he didn't reach for a story. He was arrested without incident. The French detention that followed was, by Frank's account, an education in European bureaucracy. He was held while authorities worked through the laborious process of determining exactly who he was, what he had done, and which of the multiple countries that wanted him had the strongest claim. The Americans wanted him extradited. The French had their own charges to process first. Interpol was coordinating, which in practice meant that a great deal of paperwork was moving very slowly between a great many offices. Frank spent this waiting period doing what he had always done, observing, calculating, and looking for the gap between assumption and verification. He found it in the prison staff. The story Frank told about his escape from the French detention facility is one of the more colorful episodes in his memoir, and its plausibility has been debated at length. According to Frank, he managed to convince a prison inspector that he was, in fact, an undercover American federal agent who had been operating in Europe on a classified assignment. The arrest, he told the inspector with calm authority, had been a catastrophic misunderstanding, one that was going to create serious diplomatic complications if it wasn't resolved quickly and quietly. He had contacts at the American consulate. He had a handler in Washington. He needed access to a telephone. The inspector, according to Frank, was sufficiently uncertain to make a call of his own, to someone who either confirmed Frank's story or confirmed enough of it that the inspector decided the risk of holding him outweighed the risk of releasing him. Frank walked out. Whether the escape happened precisely this way is something we will examine carefully later in this story. What the French authorities confirm is that Frank Abagnale was in their custody, and then he was not. The mechanism of his departure from their detention remains, in the official record, somewhat vague. Sweden was next. This part of the story is less dramatic, but more revealing about how Frank's operation actually worked at the ground level. He arrived in Stockholm with a new set of documents and resumed the check fraud scheme almost immediately, targeting department stores and smaller banks, keeping the individual amounts modest enough to avoid triggering the kind of scrutiny that larger transactions attracted. He was arrested in Stockholm within weeks. The Swedish imprisonment was briefer than the French one, but the pattern of what followed was similar. Frank was transferred, eventually, back to American custody, a process that took the better part of a year, threading through international extradition procedures that moved at the speed of diplomatic correspondence in the early 1970s. By the time a U.S. Marshal collected him from Swedish authorities and put him on a plane back to the United States, Frank Abagnale had spent the better part of 2 years in various states of European detention. He was 23 years old. He was going home in handcuffs. He was also, already, beginning to construct the story he would spend the rest of his life telling. The American legal proceedings against Frank Abagnale were handled in the federal system, given the interstate and international nature of his check fraud operation. He was charged on multiple counts. The evidence was substantial: canceled checks, bank records, witness identifications, a paper trail that Frank's own technical sophistication had ironically made easier to follow, because his particular method of routing number manipulation had become recognizable to investigators who knew what they were looking for. He was convicted. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He served less than 5. The early release came, according to the version of events that Frank himself has consistently told, as a result of an arrangement with the federal government. The FBI, he claimed, approached him while he was incarcerated with a proposition: work with us, consult on fraud detection, help us understand how check schemes operate from the inside, and we will arrange for your supervised release. Frank agreed. He walked out of prison in 1974, technically in the custody of the federal government, practically free. This is the part of the story that transforms Frank Abagnale from a criminal into something else, something that the American cultural imagination finds almost irresistible. The poacher turned gamekeeper, the thief hired by the bank, the man so good at deception that the system that caught him decided his skills were more valuable on the inside than his punishment was valuable as a deterrent. It is a deeply satisfying narrative. It has the clean symmetry of a good fable. And it is, in its broad outlines, the version that Steven Spielberg filmed, that Leonardo DiCaprio embodied, that $52 million production dollars brought to the screen in 2002. It is also, in several of its most important details, almost certainly not what actually happened. But we are not there yet. We are still building the legend. And the legend still has one more act to run. After his release, Frank did exactly what he had always done. He found the gap between assumption and verification, and he walked through it. This time, the gap was in the financial services industry itself. He established a consulting practice under his own name, no more aliases, no more borrowed identities, and approached banks with a straightforward pitch. He was Frank Abagnale, he told them. He was the man who had spent years defrauding the banking system with techniques that their current security protocols couldn't detect. He was now offering to show them exactly how it had been done and how to prevent it from happening to them. The banks, remarkably, said yes. There is something almost philosophically interesting about this. The same institutions that Frank had victimized were now paying him to explain the victimization. The same security frameworks that had failed to stop him were now being redesigned based on his recommendations. He was, in a very literal sense, being paid for the expertise that his crimes had generated. His consulting fees, by the early 1980s, were substantial. He was traveling again, this time in business class, on his own passport, billing clients for his time rather than stealing from their accounts. He gave seminars. He lectured at FBI field offices. He became a recognizable figure in the fraud prevention industry, a man whose biography was his credential and whose credential opened every door. The memoir came in 1980, titled Catch Me If You Can. It was co-written with journalist Stan Redding and presented Frank's story in the full-throttle style of a thriller, rich in detail, propulsive in its pacing, unapologetically entertaining. It was not presented as a cautionary tale. It was presented as an adventure. The crimes were real, but the tone was celebratory, the criminal charming, the authorities slightly bumbling, the whole enterprise shimmering with the retrospective glamour of a life fully lived outside the rules. The book sold well. It confirmed Frank's status as the most famous con artist in America. It also contained, embedded within its entertaining narrative, a series of claims that would take decades to examine properly, and that, when examined, would raise questions that the entertainment value of the story had long prevented anyone from asking too loudly. The FBI partnership, which Frank described in the memoir and in interviews as a formal arrangement that began during his incarceration, became central to his public identity. He wasn't just a former criminal, he was a reformed criminal working alongside the institution that had caught him, a symbol of rehabilitation and of the practical wisdom of turning an enemy's expertise into an asset. He spoke at FBI training sessions. He consulted on fraud investigations. He was, by his own account, and by the account of various law enforcement figures who vouched for him publicly, a genuine insider in the federal law enforcement community. The FBI never confirmed the specifics of this arrangement in any official capacity. When journalists asked the Bureau directly about the nature and extent of Frank Abagnale's relationship with them, the answers were consistently vague, neither confirming nor denying the precise details, offering language that could be interpreted as endorsement without actually constituting one. This ambiguity, it would later emerge, was not accidental. For the moment, though, the ambiguity worked entirely in Frank's favor. The absence of denial read as confirmation. The vague endorsements from individual agents read as institutional validation. Frank Abagnale, in the 1980s and 1990s, was exactly what he appeared to be, a man with an extraordinary story, credible enough in its details to be accepted, entertaining enough in its telling to be celebrated, and just verified enough in its broad outlines that nobody pressed too hard on the specific parts that didn't quite hold together. He was, in other words, still running the same con. It had just gotten bigger, considerably bigger. The Spielberg film changed everything, in scale, in reach, in the permanence of the legend it created. Steven Spielberg had been aware of Frank's story for years before the film was made. The memoir had circulated in Hollywood as an option for more than a decade. The material was obviously cinematic, the central character obviously compelling, the structure of pursuit and evasion obviously suited to the screen. Various directors and studios had looked at it and passed, for reasons that probably had more to do with financing and timing than any skepticism about the source material. When Spielberg finally committed to the project in the early 2000s, he brought with him the full weight of his reputation and his resources. Leonardo DiCaprio, coming off the enormous commercial success of Titanic, was cast as Frank. Tom Hanks played the FBI agent Carl Hanratty, a composite character loosely based on Joseph Shea, softened and complicated in the way that films based on real events tend to soften and complicate their secondary characters when the primary character needs someone to play against. The production budget was $52 million. The film opened in December of 2002 and earned over $350 million worldwide. It won 2 Academy Awards. DiCaprio's performance was nominated for a Golden Globe. The film was funny and tense and genuinely moving in places. Spielberg, at the height of his technical mastery, made the material sing in exactly the way that the material wanted to be made to sing. It was also, from beginning to end, based almost entirely on things Frank Abagnale had said about himself. No independent verification of the film's central claims, the years as a Pan Am pilot, the months as a hospital doctor, the time as a practicing attorney, was conducted as part of the production process. This was not unusual for Hollywood biopics. Studios buy stories, not audits. The entertainment value of a narrative is not contingent on its factual accuracy, and the legal standard for a biographical film is considerably lower than the legal standard for a documentary or a news report. Frank Abagnale appeared in the film himself, in a small role as a French police officer, a cameo that delighted audiences who knew his story and added a layer of self-referential irony that felt perfectly calibrated to the film's tone. The former impersonator, playing a cop, in a film about his own impersonations. It was the kind of detail that made the whole thing feel more real, more charming, more complete. The film made Frank Abagnale's legend bulletproof, or so it seemed. The demolition of a legend rarely begins with a single dramatic revelation. It begins with a detail, something small, almost trivial, that doesn't quite fit. A date that doesn't line up. A record that should exist but doesn't. A person who should remember something but has no memory of it at all. The detail sits there, quiet and patient, while the legend continues to thrive around it. And then someone with enough time and enough stubbornness starts pulling on it. In Frank Abagnale's case, the pulling started almost immediately after the legend was first assembled. A journalist named James T. Ratcliffe wrote about his skepticism as far back as 1978, when Frank visited Oklahoma City for one of his early speaking engagements. The story seemed too clean, too perfectly shaped, too conveniently cinematic. Ratcliffe reached out to Pan American Airlines directly and spoke with a company spokesman named Bruce Haxthausen. The response he received was unambiguous. "This is the first we've heard of this," Haxthausen said. "And we would have heard of it, or at least remembered it, if it had happened. You don't forget $2.5 million in bad checks. I'd say this guy is as phony as a $3 bill." That quote should have stopped the legend cold. It did not. The interview was published in a regional newspaper, noted briefly by a handful of people, and then buried under the momentum of a story that people simply wanted to believe. The legend was better than the facts. The legend had energy and charm and the irresistible shape of a great adventure. The facts were a spokesman's quote in an Oklahoma City paper. The legend won. For decades, it kept winning. The most systematic dismantling of Frank Abagnale's story came much later, from a science writer named Alan Logan, whose book on the subject, published in 2021, represented years of archival research, public records requests, court document analysis, and the painstaking reconstruction of a timeline that Frank had spent his entire career keeping deliberately blurry. Logan's central finding was both simple and devastating. The timeline didn't work. Frank Abagnale claimed that his years of impersonation and check fraud, the airline pilot, the pediatrician, the assistant attorney general, the university professor, took place between approximately 1964 and 1969, when he was between the ages of 16 and 21. This was the window during which, according to the memoir and every interview Frank ever gave, he was living free, moving between identities, cashing millions of dollars in fraudulent checks across 26 countries. Logan went through the public records and reconstructed what was actually happening during that window. He was in prison for most of it, not metaphorically, not approximately. Literally incarcerated, arrested multiple times across multiple states, processed through the criminal justice system repeatedly, sitting in various detention facilities while the legend had him soaring over the Atlantic in a Pan Am uniform. Public records showed arrests in New York, California, Massachusetts, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas during the very years Frank claimed he was operating freely as an international imposter. Frank had told audiences for decades that he was arrested exactly once, in Montpellier, France, in 1969. That single arrest, he maintained, was the moment the whole operation finally came to an end. It was a clean narrative. One arrest, one final scene. The curtain coming down on 5 years of uncatchable brilliance. The court records showed something entirely different. The mathematics of the situation, once Logan laid them out, made the most extravagant claims not just unlikely, but arithmetically impossible. Frank claimed to have cashed over 17,000 fraudulent checks, totaling $2.5 million during his years of freedom. Logan calculated the actual window of time in which Frank was definitively not incarcerated between the ages of 16 and 21. The answer was approximately 14 months. 14 months. To cash 17,000 checks across 26 countries, while also working as a hospital physician, a practicing attorney, and a Pan Am first officer. The math does not work. It does not come close to working. Even if you generously extend the timeline and minimize the prison time, the numbers require a pace of criminal activity that would have been physically impossible. A check cashed every few hours, around the clock, for over a year, while simultaneously maintaining 3 separate professional impersonations in 3 different fields. Frank, when pressed on these numbers in later interviews, would sometimes say he didn't remember the precise details. "You get to a point in your life," he told a USA Today journalist, "where you go, I don't remember what I did." It was a remarkably convenient form of amnesia for a man who had spent 40 years giving extraordinarily detailed public lectures about every specific episode of his criminal career. The Pan Am pilot story, which was the most cinematic element of the legend and the centerpiece of the Spielberg film, received particular scrutiny. Logan and other researchers contacted Pan American Airlines historical records and found no documentation of Frank Abagnale ever being employed by the airline, impersonating a crew member, or appearing in any internal security reports as a known imposter during the 1960s. Pan Am's security director, in a letter obtained during the investigation, stated flatly that there was no record of Abagnale's employment and dismissed his claims about the airline. This was not a case of records being lost or destroyed. Pan Am's internal security apparatus was sophisticated enough that a young man cashing fraudulent checks worth $2.5 million while wearing the company's uniform and flying under the company's name for 2 years would have generated a paper trail. Security incidents of that scale did not simply disappear from institutional memory. They disappeared because they hadn't happened. The pediatrician story fared no better. Logan searched hospital records in Georgia for any indication of a Frank Williams, the name Frank claimed to have used during his medical impersonation, working as a supervisory pediatric resident during the relevant period. He found nothing. No employment records, no administrative paperwork, no colleague who remembered such a person. Hospitals, even in the 1960s, kept meticulous employment records. A person working in a supervisory capacity for 11 months left traces. Frank had left none. The Louisiana Attorney General's office, when researchers inquired about a Frank Williams working as an assistant attorney general during the time period Frank specified, similarly found no record of his employment. The Louisiana State Bar, which Frank claimed to have passed on his 3rd attempt, had no record of a Frank Williams being licensed to practice law in the state during that period. 3 separate professional identities, 3 separate sets of institutional records, all 3 empty. The actual criminal record of Frank Abagnale Jr., stripped of the legend and reconstructed from documented sources, tells a considerably more modest story. He committed check fraud. This part is real. He was genuinely skilled at it, not at the level the memoir claimed, but skilled enough to operate for a period of years and cause real harm to real people. His technical manipulation of check routing numbers was, within the narrow world of check fraud, genuinely innovative for its time. His victims were not the faceless corporate entities that the memoir implied. Paula Parks Campbell was a TWA flight attendant whom Frank met in 1969. He followed her to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, stayed with her family, presented himself as a charming and trustworthy young man, and then stole approximately $1,200 from them using fraudulent checks. Paula Parks Campbell was not a bank. She was a woman who had trusted a stranger in her home, and the stranger had robbed her. In November of 1970, Frank was arrested, not for a global check fraud empire, not for $2.5 million in international fraud, but for cashing 10 fraudulent Pan American Airlines checks across 5 states totaling $1,448.60. Not millions, not thousands of checks, 10 checks, less than $1,500. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. He was released on parole in 1974. In the same year he was released, he was arrested again for stealing camera equipment from a children's summer camp in Friendswood, Texas. This was a parole violation. He was not sent back to prison. His parole officer, in records reviewed by researchers, noted finding him subsequently working at an orphanage under false pretenses, having forged a master's degree from a local university to secure the position. This is the actual Frank Abagnale, not a globe-trotting master of disguise, not a man who flew 2 million miles under a stolen identity. A petty thief with a talent for social manipulation, a criminal record scattered across multiple states, and a repeated pattern of stealing from ordinary people who had extended him the ordinary human courtesy of trust. The FBI relationship, the arrangement that Frank described as the foundation of his legitimate second career, the partnership that gave him credibility in the fraud prevention industry, the institutional endorsement that opened every boardroom door, was, according to investigators who examined the record, essentially unverifiable. The Bureau never confirmed it in any formal or documented capacity. When journalists pressed for specifics, names of agents, dates of consultations, cases where Frank's input had been material, the answers were vague to the point of meaninglessness. Individual agents would speak warmly of Frank in general terms, without confirming any specific details of the relationship. The Bureau itself, when asked officially, declined to comment. This matters because the FBI partnership was the keystone of Frank's second-act identity. Remove it, and the entire structure of his rehabilitation narrative collapses. He was not the poacher turned gamekeeper. He was not the insider who taught the institution that caught him how to protect itself. He was a man who had served his time, started a consulting business, and leveraged the claim of a government relationship to establish credibility he had not earned through any verifiable means. The consulting business, Abagnale & Associates, founded in 1976, was itself built on a foundation that the record contradicts at almost every point. Banks were hiring him based on his claimed expertise as a master fraudster. That expertise rested on a criminal career that, in its documented reality, consisted of a few years of check fraud totaling less than $1,500 per the court's own findings. The gap between the claimed credential and the actual record was enormous. Nobody checked. Nobody checked because nobody wanted to, because the story was too good. Because a man who could walk into a bank boardroom and say he had defrauded the global financial system for years was a more compelling consultant than a man who had passed a few bad checks and stolen camera equipment from children. The story was the product. It had always been the product. Frank Abagnale had not stopped being a con artist when he left prison. He had simply found a larger and more receptive market for his particular skill. There is a moment in the Spielberg film, a quiet scene near the end, after all the chases and captures and escapes, where Tom Hanks' FBI agent asks DiCaprio's Frank why he keeps running. And DiCaprio's Frank, with that particular combination of vulnerability and evasion that the performance captures so beautifully, doesn't really answer. The real Frank Abagnale, if you pressed him on the same question, why he kept running, why the story kept growing, why each telling added new details and new scales of audacity, also didn't really answer. He would smile the smile of a man who understood that the question itself was the performance, that the asking was part of the con, that every journalist who pressed him on a detail was, in the act of pressing, confirming the existence of a story worth pressing on. Because here is what Alan Logan and the other investigators ultimately found, beneath all the court records and empty archives and mathematical impossibilities. The greatest deception Frank Abagnale ever ran was not on a bank or an airline or a hospital. It was on the culture itself, on our need for a certain kind of story, the brilliant outlaw, the charming renegade, the man too clever to be caught. We built that story with him. We bought the memoir. We watched the film. We paid the consulting fees. We put him on the stage and asked him to tell us again how he had fooled us all. And he did. Over and over and over again. For decades. And we loved every minute of it. There is a particular kind of genius that does not require brilliance in the conventional sense. It does not require technical mastery or deep knowledge or years of disciplined practice in a craft. It requires only one thing: the ability to understand what people want to believe and the willingness to give it to them without hesitation. Frank Abagnale had that ability in abundance, and the final act of his life demonstrates it more clearly than anything that came before, more clearly than the uniform, more clearly than the forged checks, more clearly than the courtroom testimony and the prison sentences and the parole violations. The final act is where you see the mechanism laid completely bare. After his release from prison in 1974, Frank was 36 years old with a criminal record, no legitimate professional credentials, and a small but growing body of stories about his past that he had been refining during his incarceration the way a sculptor refines clay, adding here, subtracting there, smoothing the rough edges until the shape was exactly what he needed it to be. He had time in prison. He used it productively. He understood something fundamental about the fraud prevention industry that most people in it had not yet grasped. The industry ran on fear. Banks, corporations, and government agencies were afraid of fraud. They were afraid of it in the vague, institutional way that organizations are afraid of things they don't fully understand. Afraid enough to spend money on reassurance, but not afraid enough to rigorously verify the qualifications of the people selling it. The gap between those two levels of fear was a business opportunity. Frank recognized it immediately. He founded Abagnale and Associates in 1976. The pitch was simple, direct, and completely impossible to verify. He was the man who had beaten the system for years, who had cashed millions in fraudulent checks across 26 countries, who had impersonated professionals in multiple fields without detection. Now he was offering to show you, for a fee, how he had done it, so that you could make sure it never happened to you. The fee was not small, and the clients came. The speaking circuit expanded quickly. Frank was not simply selling consulting services to individual banks. He was becoming a presence on the national lecture circuit, appearing at corporate conferences, professional associations, and eventually, universities. He was a compelling speaker. This is something even his fiercest critics acknowledge without reservation. Frank Abagnale on a stage was everything you wanted from a former criminal turned cautionary tale. Charming without being slick, specific without being technical, self-deprecating in exactly the right measure to make the self-promotion feel like humility. He told the stories audiences wanted to hear. The Pan Am uniform, the hospital, the bar exam. He told them with the practiced ease of a man who had delivered them hundreds of times, and with just enough variation in the details to keep them feeling spontaneous. The audiences leaned forward. They laughed at the right moments. They shook their heads in disbelief. They lined up afterward to shake his hand and buy the book. The book came out in 1980. Co-written with journalist Stan Redding, Catch Me If You Can sold steadily for years before the film transformed it into a bestseller. In the pre-film years, it was a cult item, the kind of book that people pressed into the hands of friends with the instruction to read the whole thing in one sitting. Redding, by most accounts, brought the narrative discipline and the sentence-level craft. Frank brought the stories. The collaboration produced something that reads less like a memoir than like a thriller with the word "true" stamped on the cover. The word "true" was doing a great deal of work. Frank's relationship with the truth was, in the years following publication, a kind of ongoing negotiation rather than a settled position. When specific claims were challenged, as they occasionally were, by journalists with access to public records and the patience to use them, he would adjust. Not retract, never retract, but adjust. Dates would become approximate. Figures would become rough estimates. The specific hospital would become a general region. The precise number of fraudulent checks would become a lot. He became expert at what might be called the graceful retreat. the ability to give ground on a specific detail without conceding anything about the larger narrative. Yes, perhaps it wasn't exactly 11 months. Perhaps it was closer to 8. Yes, the exact amount in checks may have been somewhat less than he had originally said. These were understandable errors of memory, he would explain, given how long ago it all happened and how stressful the period had been. The effect of this technique was to anchor the legend more firmly with each small concession. By acknowledging that minor details might be imprecise, Frank implicitly confirmed that the major claims were solid. It was a rhetorical move of considerable sophistication, and it worked consistently for decades, deflecting the specific challenge while reinforcing the general story. His television appearances followed the same pattern. He appeared on talk shows, news magazine programs, and documentary segments throughout the 1980s and 90s, always interviewed with the deference that American media extends to people with compelling stories and institutional-sounding credentials. Nobody did the arithmetic in real time. Nobody had the court documents on the desk between them. The format of a television interview rewards confidence and punishes hesitation, and Frank was never hesitant. When the Spielberg film opened in December of 2002, Frank Abagnale was 54 years old and had been running the legend for over 20 years. The film did not simply validate what he had been saying, it calcified it. It took a story that had been, however popular, a matter of Frank's personal testimony and transformed it into a cultural artifact. A Spielberg film, a DiCaprio performance, a worldwide theatrical release with a $350 million gross and an Oscar nomination. You cannot fact-check a cultural artifact, not easily. Not without seeming like the kind of person who complains about historical inaccuracies during a movie that everyone else is enjoying. The film created a protective layer around the legend that personal testimony never could have managed on its own. Now, when a journalist raised questions about specific claims, the implicit response was, "Are you seriously arguing with Steven Spielberg?" Frank appeared in the film as a French police officer. 3 seconds of screen time, a uniform, a nod to the camera. It was the perfect cameo. Not the vanity of a man insisting on his own importance, but the self-aware wit of someone in on the joke. The con artist playing a cop in a film about his cons. The audiences who recognized him laughed and felt rewarded for their knowledge. He had earned the cameo by selling the story. The story had bought him a seat on the set. The set had given him 3 seconds of legitimacy that would outlast anything he could have purchased with fraudulent checks. He understood exactly what he was doing. He always had. The consulting business continued to grow in the wake of the film. Corporate clients who had been vaguely aware of Frank Abagnale before 2002 now had a vivid cultural reference point. The man from the Spielberg film. The one DiCaprio played. They hired him to speak at conferences. They hired him to review their fraud prevention protocols. They paid rates commensurate with a man whose story had grossed $350 million worldwide and whose expertise, they assumed, had been validated by the fact of the film's existence. The circular logic of this is almost beautiful in its completeness. Frank's claims about his criminal career gave him the credential to write the memoir. The memoir gave Spielberg the material for the film. The film gave Frank the cultural status that made corporate clients willing to pay for his expertise. The expertise was based on the claims. The claims were largely fabricated, but the money generated by the claims was entirely real, and by the time anyone was seriously examining the foundation, the structure built on top of it was so large and so established that the foundation barely seemed to matter. He was not, by any conventional measure, a fraud in his legitimate career. He gave value for money in the consulting business. His knowledge of check fraud methodology, however exaggerated in its claim scope, was genuine enough to be useful. His lectures were informative. His recommendations to banks on check security protocols were, by most accounts, technically sound. The problem was not that he was selling nothing. The problem was that he was selling something at the price of something else. charging for the expertise of a master criminal while possessing only the expertise of a moderately skilled one. The markup was the con. The exposure, when it finally arrived in force, came from a direction Frank could not easily dismiss. Not a newspaper with a regional circulation and no follow-up resources, but a carefully researched book with documented sources, court records reproduced in their entirety, and a methodical timeline that required no interpretation. Alan Logan's work, reinforced by independent investigations from journalists at major publications, placed the specific claims of the memoir against the specific records of the criminal justice system, and let the comparison speak for itself. The response from Frank, when the book received attention, was revealing. He did not address the specific court records. He did not explain the mathematical impossibility of his claimed criminal timeline. He did not name the colleagues from the hospital who could verify his employment, or the attorneys from the Louisiana office who remembered working alongside him. He gave interviews in which he spoke in general terms about the complexity of memory and the nature of storytelling and the difference between the literal truth and the emotional truth of an experience. He talked about the feeling of those years, the sense of freedom and fear and exhilaration, the psychological reality of living under a false identity. These are real things, and he spoke about them convincingly, because they are the parts of the story that are hardest to disprove and easiest to believe. He never addressed the 14 months. There is a question that sits at the center of all of this, and it is not the question you might expect. The expected question is, was Frank Abagnale a fraud? The answer to that question is yes, clearly, documented, mathematically demonstrable. He fabricated the central claims of a memoir that generated millions of dollars in speaking fees, consulting contracts, and entertainment rights. He allowed a major Hollywood studio to spend $52 million dramatizing events that largely did not occur. He built a second career on credentials he did not possess for crimes he did not commit at the scale he claimed. But the more interesting question is this: what does it tell us that it worked for so long? Frank Abagnale did not con the uneducated or the naive. He conned the FBI training division. He conned major American banks. He conned corporate security professionals whose entire job was to identify and prevent exactly the kind of credential fraud he was running on them in real time. He conned Steven Spielberg, one of the most commercially successful directors in the history of cinema. A man with access to research resources that most journalists cannot imagine. He conned all of them with nothing more than a story and the confidence to keep telling it. And the reason it worked, the reason it kept working for 4 decades, is the same reason every other con works. Not because the targets were stupid, but because they wanted to believe. We wanted the brilliant outlaw. We wanted the man too clever for the system. We wanted the teenager from Bronxville who ran away from his parents' divorce and somehow turned that loss into a 5-year adventure across 26 countries, outwitting banks and airlines and law enforcement agencies on 3 continents before being caught by a single determined FBI agent who eventually became his friend. That story is not true, but it is a great story. And Frank Abagnale understood, with a clarity that most professional storytellers never achieve, that a great story, delivered with conviction, is worth more than the truth. Is worth, to be precise, approximately $350 million worldwide, adjusted for the additional decades of consulting fees and lecture honoraria. Paula Parks Campbell, the flight attendant whose $1,200 started all of this, never got her money back. She gave interviews to researchers years later, still clearly unsettled by the experience, not by the theft itself, which was a relatively small amount, but by the intimacy of it, by the fact that she had let him into her life, into her family's home, and he had used that openness as the mechanism of the theft. The thing that made the crime possible was the thing she had done right. She had trusted a stranger. That detail, small, specific, unglamorous, cuts through everything else. The film doesn't include it. The memoir glosses it. The lectures never dwell on it. It doesn't fit the legend of the brilliant master criminal because it's too ordinary, too human. Too much like the thing that every petty thief does when they exploit someone's basic decency. But it is the most honest part of the story. A woman extended trust. A man exploited it. The man got caught, went to prison, and then turned the story of getting caught into the most successful con of his career. Frank Abagnale Jr. retired from public life gradually in the late 2010s, giving fewer lectures, making fewer media appearances, fading from the cultural foreground with the same quietness that he had once used to exit a room when the conversation was moving in a dangerous direction. He had always known when to leave. He left before the full weight of the exposure could attach itself to his public image, in the way it would have to someone less practiced at managing narrative. The legend he built outlasted his presence in it. The film still streams. The memoir still sells. DiCaprio's performance still earns its place in discussions of the actor's best work. The story Frank Abagnale told about himself is, in the truest sense, immortal. A permanent part of the cultural record, more alive in the imagination than the documented truth will ever be. Which is, when you think about it, the most audacious con of all. Not the checks, not the uniform, not the bar exam or the hospital or the French prison escape. Those things are small, disputed, probably mostly invented. The audacious con was this. A man with a modest criminal record and a gift for storytelling convinced the entire world, the FBI, the banks, the studios, the audiences, the critics, the late-night hosts, the corporate security professionals, the United States government, that he was the greatest con artist who had ever lived. And in doing so, he became exactly that. Not the con artist from the memoir, not the Frank of the film, but something stranger and in some ways more impressive. A man who conned his way into being a legend about conning. Who told a lie so completely and for so long that the lie became the truth became a film, and the film became the evidence. He was never caught. Not really. Not for the thing that mattered. If you've made it this far, you already know this channel is worth your time. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next story. Because in the world of crime, deception, and human psychology, the truth is almost always stranger than the legend. Almost always. Almost.